Are you as abundance pilled as I am? No, the abundance liberalism shit is a psyop and you shouldn't fall for it. Neoliberals have looked for like 1,000 different ways of rebranding because fundamentally their ideology has failed and is dead. Everyone is turning away from it at like a record speed. I literally found a tweet for this. Hold on. It's neoliberalism. It's supply side liberalism. It's the new left. It's third way. It's meritocracy. It's public-private partnerships. It's corporate social responsibility. It's pragmatic liberalism. It's growth and fairness economy. It's popularism. It's opportunity economy. It's abundance liberalism. It's the same thing. It's always the same thing. Can you quickly sum up neoliberalism, please? Neoliberalism is when there's something and I don't like it, is the main thing. I thought that was fascism. Well, you repeat yourself. The abundance liberal thing it's a complete psyop. It's a complete psyop. Article from the fucking Economist. Okay, like neoliberals recognize everyone hates them. So what do we do to rebrand in opposition to Trump's current administration? Well, Trump's current administration seems to be, funnily enough, all about austerity, right? Americans will face hardship, tariffs will increase the price of goods, eggs cost too much, inflation, etc., etc., etc. You will have less. So what if we rebrand it as like, no, actually, you know, Howard Lutnick thinks you shouldn't get cheap treats from China. I think you should get cheap treats from China. You know, I think that actually the market should be allowed to run in such a way that things stay cheap and you get whatever you want. But it doesn't fix the underlying problems at all, because what they're arguing for, unfettered markets, free trade, etc., is what we've been doing for decades. Like what they're arguing for basically is, well, what if we did NAFTA and didn't have tariffs? And it's like, well, we had that for years and then we got Trump. We literally did that and it created the conditions that produced this mess. Hold on, I found a Fox 5 on this. What is an abundance liberal? Fox 5, Washington, D.C. Please, just, why not? Pitch it at me.
My guest is the editor-in-chief of Washington Monthly and a former speechwriter for President Bill Clinton. His latest piece, The Meager Agenda of Abundance Liberals, explores...
Of course it would be a former speechwriter of Bill Clinton.
The challenges facing progressive policymakers after their disastrous 2024 election. Paul Glastrus up late with me tonight again here on the Final Five. Paul, welcome back to the show.
Jim, my friend, glad to be back.
What is an abundance liberal?
There's a whole group of writers and think tank scholars who are arguing that if we get rid of government red tape, things like zoning restrictions, environmental statutes, that we can have abundance, we can have more housing, more green energy, cheaper, quicker transportation projects, lower healthcare costs. People like Ezra Klein of the New York Times, Matt Iglesias, the
just great
Substack writer, a lot of people at The Atlantic like Yoni Applebaum.
Me when I'm pitching a brand new style of liberalism that'll definitely work. Ezra Klein and Matt Iglesias. Just, oh no, obviously.
Groups like the Niskanen Center. This is their big thing, and they're making a big push, and they're getting a whole lot of attention in the media and from Democratic donors and elected officials.
Right before I came in here to talk with you, I saw Ezra Klein up on one of the cable networks. Here's the thing. What you're talking about in the piece here, the progressives today, and you kind of laid that out, they're focusing more on removing barriers than actively shaping what economic policy should look like.
Because again, they're just neoliberals. They're just more neoliberal. It's just the same neoliberals. They're just coming up with a new term for it. It's the exact same thing. It's the same thing. But I see people talk. I think it's mostly a meme. It's mostly a buzzword. But let this serve as a broader warning. Don't let liberals take the reins of what is happening here. Don't let liberals be the ones to define for you what went wrong and what needs to happen. These are the same people who think that Bernie Sanders represents a naive, antiquated form of political thought that no longer has a place in DC. Like, these are the same people who think that progressives are at best naive and at worst are just as bad as the MAGA Republicans. These are the people who created the problems that we're experiencing right now, created the conditions, nullified the Democrats so they're unable to do anything about Trump. They're not our friends.
How is this different from Democrats we've seen in the past, from President Clinton, from President Obama, others?
I think it's got some similarities to what you saw in the Clinton administration with.
How is this different from neoliberalism? Well, funny you asked. It actually has a lot in common with neoliberalism. Now, so okay, so first of all, I must acknowledge, yeah, it's pretty much just,
reinventing government, taking away procedural barriers that keep civil servants from doing their jobs, deregulation of the airline industry and the trucking industry under Jimmy Carter, the financial industry. I think there's a lot of overlap between past Democratic administrations and what these folks are talking about, and that's why they're hitting a nerve. A lot of Democratic donors and elected officials are feeling like the Biden administration was too far left. And
Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ.
That deregulation might be a way forward.
Would you imagine, in your time when you...
By the way, the reason they call this abundance liberalism is because they are cynical and they hate you, and they chose that term to mimic the style of left populist rhetoric. Like they are deliberately dishonest. Yeah, it's a bait and switch. They chose that term because they want some of the clout of the actual left-leaning people who are making arguments in favor of like Medicare for all or whatever, when in reality they're to the right of most Democrats.
Worked with President Clinton, that somebody like Joe Biden would be considered to be too far left, too progressive?
No. And never did I imagine that the editor of the Washington Monthly, a moderate publication, that it favors taking on corporate power and interests and is a little bit suspicious of this whole deregulatory move, would be considered a left-wing guy, because, that's not what the magazine has been. That's not what I was been. But today, our critique of this whole abundance liberal thing is, even if you did everything that they said, it would not move the needle much to bring us more housing, more affordable energy, that we have bigger problems than that. I mean, I think they're right about the reform agenda. They're just very narrow in what they would do. They're kind of afraid to go after the real problem, which is this combination of oligarchic control of the economy meets conservative destruction of the government. That's what we're actually experiencing now. And, getting rid of unnecessary, procedures is helpful, but not sufficient.
All right. So
there is an element of truth to this. Sean just donated on that. We can hate on neoliberalism, but Ezra Klein's right about this. He's not arguing for unfettered free markets. He's pointing out the Dems' response has often been bad regulation. Horrendous zoning laws is one of the primary reasons we have a shortage of housing, but no one wants to fix it because housing price will crash. That is true, but like the problem with this is that all like these high-minded efforts to address things like bad housing policy will ultimately run up against like a big enemy that abundance liberals are never willing to deal with, and that's corpos. Like at the end of the day, they answer to wealth. You can talk a big game about being willing to really take on the challenges with the housing industry, bring down housing costs, whatever else. Corporations will inflate those housing prices as much as they can get away with. You might be able to do in Austin, Texas, and bring rent down on aggregate 16% over the course of 5 years by building a bunch of new housing. But don't worry, those rents will go right back up. You're fighting an uphill battle against an enemy much more powerful than you, And we're at a boiling point here now, because now the capital class has mobilized so aggressively and so openly and so malevolently against the interests of the average American in the form of this like open oligarchy. It's no longer acceptable to pretend that we can just make marginal tweaks around the edges. You need like a unified front. And I agree, like neoliberals aren't bad because they've never had good policy propositions. As a matter of fact, neoliberals, or I guess liberals broadly, often know more about policy wonkery than leftists do, which has always been a weakness of the left. My issue with them isn't necessarily the policy tweaking. My issue is that all of that policy tweaking is ultimately subservient to a larger class dynamic, which they refuse to fight. You know what I mean? Yes, 100% agree. You can't affect a lot of these changes until you remove big business from policymaking. Yeah, okay. I agree with you completely. But I am willing to acknowledge the importance of like addressing zoning laws. Holy shit, the Abundance Liberal Conference was sponsored by venture capitalists and a co-brother created nonprofit. Yeah, sounds about right. The new centrist push to regain control of the Democratic Party. You know, Will Stansel was on Twitter saying he doesn't like this abundance liberal shit. That to me, that's like that's a canary in the coal mine, ain't it? Right there. Like if you have even the big hitter liberals, the big hitter like posters being like, no, I don't think so. You will get the commie blocks and you will thank us for them when we decommodify housing. Here, I want to finish this. I've just seen too much buzz. It's a very online thing, but it's just important to not let these backstabbers get in the way of actual solution making. You know?
So what are some of the policies that you think that they should be pushing towards that maybe they're missing? Because we've heard from the likes of Pete Buttigieg, who had said that he thinks that there's too much focus on identity politics within the party.
Yeah.
Obviously, he's somebody who may have his eyes towards 2028. I mean, what is the current crop of Democrats? What are they missing in this conversation?
Look, 10 to 30% of Americans are self-employed. They are contractors, they're gig workers, they're Uber drivers. Neither party does anything to help those folks, to market to them. They look more and more like America. They are the base of the Democratic Party. The Democrats barely talked about them, and they're being crushed by both a lack of support from welfare, from social.
Didn't Biden's labor or the NLRB, didn't they extend additional protection? No, there was a Biden era push for like the recognition of like Uber drivers as workers rather than contractors. There's been a push for that broadly. Now I agree. The abuse of contractors is a real problem with our economy.
Welfare, they're taxed higher and they don't get the benefits that employees get, and they're being crushed by monopolists and tech platforms that they work for. The average somebody selling products on Amazon has seen their fees go up from 10% to 30%. These people need help. Democrats should be their champions. We need healthcare reform where we can regulate the prices that are paid to conglomerate monopoly healthcare providers that could boost the incomes of the average family $2,000-$3,000 right off the bat.
This is corporatism, not capitalism argument. Yeah, also you're really arguing around the margins. Like the country is being raped to death by oligarchs. I like the fundamental solution here is not like reform of contracting law. I agree that should be a part of it, but it matters a lot what you define as the central solution. And I'm sorry, like at these days, the lines are really clear. If you can't stand up and say the problem with our society is like oligarchy, capitalism, unfettered power of the capital class, then I don't with you. It's just really obvious now is the thing. Even liberals are saying it. Even liberal politicians, not far left Democrats, but moderate Democrats are going up there and saying like oligarchy's out of control. These ultra wealthy people are buying power. The Trump's cabinet of billionaires, Elon Musk, shadow president, et cetera, et cetera. And I know those people aren't socialists, but at the very least, this guy did acknowledge it, by the way, with the oligarchy. But like, do you think that's going to be fixed by addressing contracting law? Maybe that'd be nice, but I wouldn't define an ideology around it. You know, like I'm a huge proponent of reforming zoning laws in many, I suppose, all American cities to whatever extent possible. But if I created a political movement called like abundance, urbanism, and defined it in opposition to progressive leftism, wouldn't I be doing everyone a disservice? Could leftist thought not incorporate reform of contracting law, the abuse of workers? Because it already does. Left progressives already talk about, contractors not getting the benefits of employees, corporations abusing contractor law. They actually debated this on Breaking Points. Yo!
Joining us now, great friend of the show, Jarek Thompson, and he is out with the new book, which is just seemingly everywhere, Abundance, that he co-authored with Ezra Klein. So the theme of the book is, quote, to trace the history of the 21st century so far, to trace the history of unaffordability and shortage after years of refusing to build sufficient housing. America has a national housing crisis. He goes on that Abundance explains our problems today are not the results of yesteryear's villains. Rather, one generation's solutions have become the next generation's problems. The book actually seeks to put forward some solutions. So, Derek, just at the top here, for people who aren't familiar with abundance discourse, there's been quite a bit here that is online. First, just tell us like why you guys felt compelled to write the book, and then how
I just want to watch a bit.
The book, how the book is intended to be received. Is it a Project 2025? Is it a political answer? Is it all of the above? What is your guys' conception of it?
It's a great question. I love this way of beginning. So we started writing this book 2.5 years ago when we were motivated by and scandalized by exactly what you said, the crises of manufactured scarcity in the 21st century. Why aren't there enough homes? Why isn't there enough clean energy? Why is governance, often in blue cities and blue states, so bad that it seems to...
Capital. The answer to all these things is unambiguously capital. Real estate holders, both private and like personal and corporate, want to maintain the value of the properties they hold. So there's an incentive towards artificial scarcity, reinforced by zoning laws that are controlled at a municipal level, which they incentivize heavily in their direction. Likewise, like a lack of abundance of green energy, literally subsidies. Literally just subsidies. Like the relationship between fossil fuel companies in Washington is so well documented and so extensive and so blatant. Trump's drill baby drill. Like you can't fix that with wonkery, right? Like policy wonkery. You're not going to go into DC and go like, well, what if we made green energy cheap and affordable everywhere? You would instantly have like the political spectrum would descend upon you because of all the money that backs fossil fuels. Like that's the point, right? We have an enemy here. Also, yeah, this chair is absolutely massive now that I look at it.
To be driving many people away. Why doesn't the Democratic Party have an invention agenda, given how central science and technology are to human progress? These are the questions that really animated the project.
But technological progress isn't what we need right now. Well, it's always good, don't get me wrong. We need social progress. We have incredible medicine and a record number of homeless people sleeping underneath overpasses. We have unimaginable wealth concentrated in our cities. Meanwhile, Appalachia dies with nothing to support it. Like the problem we face isn't one of like a lack of technological, like, yeah, okay, we get it. Everyone has a smartphone in their pocket now, but a lot of people in America today still are food insecure. This inequality is the issue, and that's a social problem. You're not going to technology your way out of this.
But I think it's really important to ground the fact that the book came out in March 2025, because you look back over the last 6 months of news. Why did Donald Trump just win the election? If you ask Pew, if you ask Gallup, if you ask David Shore and the 28 million people that he surveyed, the answer is all the same. It's affordability, affordability, affordability. People feel like there's an affordability crisis in this country.
I also just don't agree with this. I think that overwhelmingly it's about dissatisfaction with the current system, and people will believe any narrative that they're presented as an explanation for why. It's about media control. It's about dissatisfaction. It's about ennui. I don't think it's fundamentally about affordability. You know, in terms of like purchasing power parity, Americans are exceptionally privileged. There are plenty of countries out there where people have not done this far right shift, and they struggle to purchase stuff way more than we do. Our groceries are relatively cheap compared to a lot of countries out there where we're very, very wealthy. So I don't think it's that. I think people accept narratives that they're presented.
And the biggest part of anybody's budget is housing. So at the center of an affordability crisis is
So you're saying it's not about material conditions? No, I'm saying it's overwhelmingly about material conditions. But the propaganda atmosphere and the dissatisfaction with the status quo are material conditions.
Housing affordability crisis. You know, Donald Trump won because of an affordability crisis. And my feeling is he came into office and could have said, like, I'm going to govern as a Texan Republican. I'm going to make it as easy as possible for us to build homes. I'm going to do everything I can to drive down the...
No, he's not. What are you talking about? He's not doing that. He's not doing that at all. What are you talking about?
the cost of housing. But instead, one of the first things he does is to raise tariffs on Mexico and Canada. That's a 25% bump on the cost of lumber and drywall gypsum, which we get from Mexico. The lumber comes from Canada. This is a plan to treat scarcity of housing with yet more scarcity. So I really want to emphasize the degree to which we strongly believe that there is a totally different way to think about growing the supply of the most important things in this country.
Got it.
So you have a lot of critics on the left. You also have some fans on the left, but you have a lot of critics on the
He
left.
said he could have? Oh, I apologize. Then I misheard.
I'm not a hater of abundance, but my own assessment is that it misses some things, and maybe it's not meant to be a complete ideology, which is part of what I want you to respond to, because with housing in particular, I'm in favor of a more YIMBY mindset of reducing these zoning regulations, et cetera. But we can put this tear sheet up on the screen, guys. Zephyr Teachout had, I think, a good response to the abundance, to your book and some of the ideas offered therein. And she says basically like, look, some of these things have been tried, and it hasn't really solved the problem. She points to a study from the Urban Institute of Land Use Reforms across 1,100 plus cities from 2000 to 2019, found that those sorts of reforms increase the housing.
We already have an abundance in food, yet people starve in America. Yeah, that's an excellent point. In terms of like the absolute availability of goods, we have essentially, functionally, infinite food in this country. If you talk about what we produce, like leaving aside the fact that like if a tomato doesn't look perfect, they don't send it out or whatever, like, but even after that reduction, we have an insane amount of food in this country. We waste so much, there's still so much. We have infinite food, but there's still a lot of food insecurity, right? We're talking ultimately about social issues, inequality, not about the actual availability of goods. We're talking about food deserts, not about there not being food,
Supply by only 0.8% within 3 to 9 years of passage. So when I look at that, I think, okay, well, what is missing from this picture? And I think part of what is missing is this overall landscape of inequality, corporate consolidation of power.
But for housing, there legitimately isn't enough of it to an extent, and that usually comes down to municipal laws and zoning and what have you, and also like a desire to arbitrarily inflate the price of the existing units that are on the market. But also a lot of it is artificial scarcity being arbitrarily enforced by corporations. Do you have any idea how many empty apartment buildings there are in your city? I don't know where you live. Maybe you live in a place where there's basically no empty housing. You probably don't, though. You probably live in a place where there is empty housing. You take a look at the rents lately. There is an incentive for a lot of these landlords to keep the rent really high and wait for the high income earners to come in and pay for it, rather than lowering the rent to make it more broadly available to the people who already live in the area. This is why you have these problems like, say, for example, in Manhattan. I just went to New York City. Manhattan does have a lot of empty apartments. They're very expensive. I would struggle to afford them, even though I'm a multi-billionaire for my YouTubing practice. But is Manhattan not full of low-income people? Right? Like, in Manhattan, are there not baristas, janitors, civil workers? Aren't there people who make $50,000, $60,000 a year or less in Manhattan? Of course there are. But they don't live in Manhattan. They have to commute in. And this is a problem, because you create high-demand areas where there's an incentive to keep the rent prices high enough that only the highest income earners, only the people who can afford them, are capable of moving in. Then where does everyone else have to go? Well, they have to live like an hour out of the city, and that floods the MTA, that floods your roads, because everyone has to commute in. Commute in. It's pretty f***ed up.
Money in politics, because even when you strip away the regulations, guess what? The people who have money in this country are overwhelmingly the super rich. That's who companies want to cater to. You have massive consolidation within the industry of developers, so they're, giant monopolies at this point. And so even with the regulations stripped away, they're like, yeah, but I'm going to build luxury mansions because that's...
Also, I just want to say, because I know that I've gone hard against her in the past, but Crystal Ball has been a dub factory for like a year now. Like, genuinely, every time I see anything from Crystal Ball, it's just W after W. So, whatever. I'm fully, every time I see Crystal Ball doing something, I'm like, yeah, I'm here for it. And Kyle too. Well, of course, but Kyle, yeah. I mean, Kyle and I have been on good terms for a long time. I'm just saying,
who has the money. I'm going to build luxury condos, so that's who has the money. So, do you mean for this to be a sort of like complete theory of what's going on? Or is it like, this is one piece that we're looking at seriously so that if Democrats get back in power, we have these governance pieces kind of ready to go?
It's such a good question. And there's so much there. I'm going to try to touch on as much of it as I can keep in my head.
Yeah.
We're trying to usher in a paradigm shift. We think that liberalism of the last 50 years has become consumed by process and not consumed by outcomes. And that's how you get a world where in San Francisco, if you want to build a new apartment building with public money, there are so many riders attached to that public money that in fact developers have essentially pulled out and said, we don't want to build social housing at all. It's a world where in 2021, when there was a development that was being discussed to put up at 500 units in a Nordstrom valet parking lot, 100 of which would have been below market rent. In fact, the Board of Supervisors of San Francisco voted it down because it didn't pass sufficient environmental review. There is a thicket of laws and reviews and customs that have grown up in the last 50 years. They're environmental laws, they're legal norms. Sometimes they're just a sense of empowered gentry, empowered homeowners who want to stop any new development that could
This is not incorrect, by the way.
Possibly threaten their home values. This set of rules and customs of laws has, I think, accumulated over the last 50 years without a sufficient counterpunch. We become so process obsessed that we haven't sort of cleared the brush and thought, wait, this is about building houses for people to live. You mentioned the fact that we live in a time, I think, of concerning income inequality, absolutely, and even incipient oligarchy. But I would frame it a little bit this way. Is oligarchy worse in Utah than in California? Is oligarchy worse in Texas than California? Is oligarchy worse in, say, Georgia than Massachusetts? Right? The problems of oligarchy are national. And yet we very clearly see that different cities and states have tremendously different outcomes when it comes to the ability to add housing.
So I would say...
Okay. So Crystal Ball asked him, like, is this an all-encompassing theory? And then his answer is essentially... like, the implied answer that he just gave is no, this addresses its own thing, but it's like, then how does this solve the oligarchy thing, is my point. Or I guess the capital accumulation thing. I don't understand the response, I suppose.
I would say, actually, to respond to that directly, I actually do think the problem of oligarchy is worse in a place like, or at least inequality, is worse in a city like San Francisco, New York, Miami, places that are magnets, not just domestically, but globally for the richest of the rich. You end up with this sort of super class of people who can spend the millions and millions of dollars that it takes, and then an underclass of people who are there to serve them who can't afford rent. So which gets to another one of my questions to you, and one of the critiques that I've seen of the book and the paradigm shift contained therein, is that there's a couple of assumptions that are taken here. One is that the right way to organize our society is having these giant megalopolises, the San Franciscos, the LAs, the New Yorks of the world, where, it wasn't always the case. We used to have thriving manufacturing and other industry throughout the country, so people were more widely spread out. Obviously, that helps with being able to afford housing because you just have a more dispersed population. That's number one. And then number two, related to that, is the focus too much on these cities? So, and this gets back to the question of whether this is a governing agenda, a political, like electoral political agenda, or both. Because obviously, Democrats have slid a little bit in the cities, but they still perform really well in these giant cities. We don't really need the Democratic Party to do better in San Francisco. So is the project also a little too focused on these giant urban city centers and taking for granted that that's where the core of, American innovation and prosperity and just population density should really be?
I love this question. There's so much here. Let me try to consolidate it into an answer that matches everything you put on the table. Let's say the outcome that you cared about, because we believe in an outcome-based liberalism. Let's say the outcome that you really cared about was income inequality. Well, of course, you would want there to be a tax and spend redistribution policy, right? You might want to expand the EITC. You might want to expand child tax credits. You might want to expand welfare. All of these are important. But if you're really interested in reducing inequality, I think you should be absolutely obsessed with urban housing policy. The Harvard economist Ross Chetty has pointed out that upward mobility in this country, when you build a map of it and see, who has the best chance of being born into a lower or working class and working their way into the upper middle class, it's in these cities. It's close to these cities. If we want to give more Americans a chance to move forward in their life, we should make it easier for people to live where they want to live, especially if those are some of the highest, most productive, most highly productive cities in the country. And in fact, Crystal, for much of the last century, this is how American migration worked. If you were working class, you would move closer to these cities and it would benefit you because the housing cost wouldn't overwhelm the income benefits that you would gain from moving to a high income place. But something has unwound very, very much in the last 50 years, where it's the cheapest places in the country that have the lowest upward mobility. And it's the most expensive places in the country that have the highest upward mobility. And so in a way you can say it's like the American dream has been torn apart. People have to...
Again, I'm waiting for like an in here. The problem is that he's correct. It's just that what he's describing is already a component of progressive urbanism and housing reform. So it's like you're taking a holistic political movement and you're taking a little chunk of it and you're trying to break it off and you're trying to make it its own thing. And the implication of that being, of course, you're doing it in an oppositional sense. Like, oh, no. We don't need progressivism. We just need to fix this. I'd love to fix that. But that's not enough, It's just a little portion. Sorry, I'm getting lost in the weeds here at this point. I'm basically just watching it. At what point did they say we don't need progressivism? It's the implication behind taking a chunk of economically progressive policy and defining a movement based on it. Also, we know for a fact, we know who Ezra Klein is, right? Like, we know which kinds of people favor this. Also, upward mobility. I don't want people to move up. I want people to be up by default. It's that meritocratic framing, like opportunity economy shit that Kamala Harris was behind. I don't give a fuck about that. Opportunity economy. So you have the opportunity to do well, you should just do well by default.